The year is 1475. To the rest of Europe, the Ottoman Empire isn't just a kingdom, it is an inevitable, crushing force of nature. 2 decades earlier, Sultan Mehmed the Conqueror had breached the Theodosian walls of Constantinople, ending the Roman Empire forever. Since then, the Ottoman war machine had swallowed the Balkans, turned the Black Sea into a Turkish lake, and sent shockwaves as far as Rome. But as the Sultan looked north toward the heart of Europe, he found a stubborn, bloody obstacle. A small principality called Moldavia, led by a man who refused to kneel, Stephen III, later known to history as Stephen the Great. To the Sultan, Stephen was a nuisance, a rebel prince ruling a land of peasants. To crush this defiance, Mehmed did not send a mere raiding party. He commissioned a juggernaut. Under the command of Haddam Suleiman Pasha, the governor of Rumelia, an army of 120,000 men began to march. This was a force of professional killers, elite janissaries, armored Sipahi cavalry, and thousands of auxiliary troops. Their mission was simple: erase Moldavia from the map. The scorched earth. Stephen the Great was many things, but he was not a fool. He knew that in a set-piece battle on an open field, his 40,000 men, mostly Razeshi, or free peasants with bows and scythes, would be slaughtered in an hour. To defeat the Sultan's shadow, he had to make the land itself fight back. As the Ottoman column crossed the border, they didn't find glory. They found a wasteland. Stephen enacted a total scorched earth policy. He ordered his people to burn their own crops, hide their grain in secret pits, and drive their livestock into the deep Carpathian forests. Most crucially, he ordered the poisoning of the wells. For weeks, the 120,000-man Ottoman army marched through a silent, blackened landscape. There was no bread to seize, no wine to drink, and every sip of water from a local stream brought the risk of dysentery and death. Hunger began to do what steel had not yet tried. The Ottoman soldiers, exhausted and irritable, were constantly harassed by Moldavian light cavalry that struck from the tree lines at night and vanished before a single arrow could be returned. Suleiman Pasha, driven by the pressure of the Sultan's expectations, pushed his men harder. He was lured deeper and deeper into the Moldavian interior toward a trap he couldn't see, in a valley he didn't recognize. The geography of death. By early January, the Ottoman army reached the vicinity of Vaslui. The weather was miserable, a damp, biting cold that chilled the bone. Stephen had chosen his ground with the precision of a master jeweler. He positioned his forces at the Podul Inalt, or the High Bridge, near the confluence of the Rakova and Barlad rivers. The geography here was a death sentence for a large army. The valley was narrow, flanked on both sides by steep wooded hills and treacherous, half-frozen marshes. The only way forward for the Ottomans was across a bridge and through a bottleneck of mud. On the morning of January 10th, a thick, claustrophobic fog rolled into the valley. It was so dense that a rider could barely see the ears of his own horse. For Suleiman Pasha, this fog was a frustration. For Stephen, it was the final piece of his plan. The acoustic trap. Stephen knew that in the fog, the ears become more important than the eyes. He stationed a small group of trumpeters and drummers on a hill far to the left of his actual battle line. As the Ottoman vanguard, the elite janissaries, began to cross the bridge and enter the valley, Stephen gave the signal. From the woods, the hidden musicians began to blast their war horns and beat their drums with frantic intensity. In the blinding fog, the sound echoed off the valley walls, creating an auditory illusion. Suleiman Pasha, convinced that the Moldavian main force was directly in front of the sound, ordered his troops to charge. "The infidels are there!" he shouted. The Ottomans surged forward into the center of the valley, screaming their war cries, ready to shatter the Moldavian line. But there was no line. The Ottomans charged into empty air and deep, sucking mud. They had been baited into the softest, most treacherous part of the marsh. As the 120,000-man mass pressed forward, the soldiers in the front tried to stop, realizing they were walking into a swamp. But the thousands behind them, blinded by the fog, continued to push, trampling their own brothers-in-arms into the freezing muck. The harvest of the peasants. With the Ottoman center bogged down and confused, Stephen unleashed the real storm. From the wooded heights on the flanks, thousands of Moldavian peasants let out a roar. They didn't use the complex formations of Western knights. They used the terrifying efficiency of men defending their homes. Hidden Moldavian artillery, positioned on the slopes, began to fire blindly into the dense mass of Ottoman soldiers. At such close range, every shot found a target. Then came the Razashi. They descended from the hills like a landslide. Armed with long-handled scythes, heavy axes and bows, they fell upon the trapped janissaries. The struggle was primal. Because the Ottomans were packed so tightly in the bottleneck, they couldn't even draw their long Kielage swords or level their spears. They were sitting ducks for the Moldavian archers, who rained down arrows from the fog. Stephen himself, at the age of 42, led his heavy cavalry in a decisive charge into the Ottoman rear. The shadow of God's army broke. The invincible professional soldiers of the Sultan turned and fled, but there was nowhere to go. The bridge was blocked by the dead, and the river was a slush of ice and blood. The Great Humiliation. The retreat turned into a massacre that lasted for days. Stephen's forces pursued the remnants of the Ottoman army for over 60 miles, all the way to the Danube River. History records that very few of the 120,000 returned to Constantinople. Suleiman Pasha escaped, but his reputation was in tatters. When the fog finally cleared over the valley of Vaslui, the sight was so gruesome that even the victors were silenced. Tens of thousands of Ottoman corpses lay in the mud, the elite of an empire, defeated by a force a third of its size. Stephen's response to this world-shaking victory was uncharacteristically humble. He forbade any celebration. He credited the victory entirely to the divine, and for 40 days he fasted on nothing but bread and water. He refused to let anyone call him the Great, though the world would soon insist on it. The legacy of the athlete. The news of Vaslui traveled at lightning speed. To a Europe that lived in constant fear of the Turkish terror, Stephen became a beacon of hope. Pope Sixtus IV granted him the title Athleta Christi, the athlete of Christ. But for Stephen, the victory was practical. He had bought his people time. He had proven that the Ottoman Empire was not an elemental force that couldn't be stopped. It was an army of men, and men could be outsmarted, outmaneuvered, and broken. Stephen would go on to rule for nearly 5 decades, building a stone church for every victory he won. Today, those churches still stand across the Romanian landscape, silent witnesses to a time when a peasant prince looked at the greatest empire on earth and didn't blink. The Battle of Vaslui remains a masterclass in asymmetrical warfare. It serves as a reminder that numbers are a ghost, and that in the fog of war, the person who knows the land and has the courage to use it is the one who truly holds the power.